Oh, hello. I'd like to call this first little series One Nation Under Education. And we'll just leave it at that for right now. But my first lesson today is just really a simple question, which is what's the purpose of education? So pause, think about that a minute. What do you think the purpose of education is? Okay, coming back, let's ask a few questions in addition to that. Is education system meant for rigorous academic instruction? Is it supposed to be to provide good citizenship? Or is it to provide a solid workforce? So these are some questions that I think maybe we need to just pause and ask. There's a lot of talk about education right now, but let's just take a minute and say, what do we think the purpose of education is? Historically speaking, let's just look at countries. I'm sure you can imagine, education tends to align with whatever historical, political ambitions are of those times. So you can imagine Cold War Russia, the kinds of lessons that they would have about the United States, for example, or we don't know what the curriculum is like in North Korea, but I'm sure there's a lot of assumptions that it's meant to guide students um, into a certain ideology. And we can't take away that we don't do the same thing. We meaning the United States. So, one nation under education, and I hope you'll kind of forgive me for this. This is kind of something new I've been researching, so I might need to look at my notes. But let's just think about this. Generally speaking, um, educational organizations and facilities, at least within the last 120 years, were labeled as factory modeled schools or factory model education or industrial era schools. And those are really from the 18th and 19th century. And number one, they were modeled after a top down approach, which is a focus on that schools are meant for production. Makes sense in the industrial era. So, one example of this is a quote that said, the factory model schools are designed to create docile subject and factory workers. Now, that's probably under a lot of contention right now, but as an educator for as long as I have been, I see that the education system is very conducive towards big business and corporations. You come in, sit down, shut up, just listen to the instructor and do what you're told. Don't really think for yourself. So I think number one, the whole model is based on we build these institutions and then we try to figure out how to educate kids in the meantime. When really it should be the opposite. We should figure out what kind of kids do we want to educate and then build the institutions around that. So speaking of that, I found an interesting quote that said, schools have become in some aspects like factories, but not necessarily mimicking factories or preparing kids to work in factories. Rather, both in the workplace and the schools, as well as other 19th century institutions, were partaking in the same ethos of efficiency, manipulation, and mastery. And that was from Carl Kastel, Pillars of the Public Common Schools, 1983. So I think the point is that number one, we have this top-down approach, and I feel like that's been from the beginning of the industrial era, and we still have it. We still have people in our institutions at the higher areas giving directions, and we follow suit. So I think the ideology is absolutely following along the lines of the factory system. Number two, let's just look at the architecture. I found this really interesting. Unlike the single room school factories, like for me it was like Little House on the Prairie, thinking about, oh, there's just one little room. Once the industrial era happened, this was the direction. Factory model schools tend to be a similar configuration, 800 to 900 square feet, facilitating approximately 28 to 35 students of the same age. And This is a quote: as school-age schools became larger, the models were replaced with classrooms created in a series of boxes, often along double-wide corridors, designed as what were called and termed cells and bells by architects, especially at the high school level. You need cells and bells to have that industrial feel. And it was used in conjunction with model schools. Then, and I don't know, some of you might remember this, I know I do. Uh, well, after the baby boomer generation, they started to renovate schools because they were considered unsafe and overcrowded. So they started building these pods, or what they used to call portables, like these facilities. I've learned in them, I've taught in them. So, so to just kind of recap, the question is, what is the purpose of schools? And I think what I take away from this is that schools have been just used to weaponize the masses, weaponize majorities. And whatever we're learning in schools happens to be whatever the top priority politicians, economists of the time tend to be. So in the Middle Ages, for example, I feel like it was the concentration was on the church. If you were, like I said, Cold War Russia, it might look differently, but schools are still used as a manipulative tool. And so, number one, the ideology is from the top down, and we just tend to follow suit. Number two, even the architecture of schools is set up to be conducive, to factory-style systems. And then number three, I just kind of want to end up with saying that I think as philosophers, or I don't know, just even as a teacher, like what kind of students are we producing? Who are we putting out there in this world? Are we just producing docile, paradoxically angry students who feel used sometimes, complacent students who are just being used by those in power? And so I think we need to consider the purpose of education and really what kind of students are we producing out there? And do we want that? Do the masses want that, or is that specifically congenial to those who are in power? So, welcome to One Nation Under Education. Thoughts to contemplate. Thanks for listening.